Welcome to From X to Z, the show that believes you never age out of learning about the world around you. Featuring social media maven Danielle, Farage, and Mervyn and Dinnen, the analyst who puts the X in expert. They're here to talk all things jobs, HR, and trends. So mind the generational gap. This is From X to Z, only on the Purple Acorn Network.
Hello. Welcome back to From X to Z. My name is Danielle Farage, and I'm joined by the one and only Mervyn Dinnen, your favorite Gen X expert.
Thank you very much. Yes,
Isn't that
I
right?
like that.
Okay,
Your Gen
perfect.
X, your Gen X expert of choice.
You're Gen expert. Hey. Well, how are you today, Mervyn? We're gonna start off the show a little bit differently. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you.
You're fine.
Danielle.
Okay.
Yeah. It's one or two kind of pressing challenges. Nothing to do with work. Nothing to do with health either. But it's kind of I'm okay. And how are you?
I'm pretty good. I had something fall through last week. Not the most fun thing in the world, but just focusing on what I can control. And the good news is that my physical therapy is almost over. So I'm almost back to 100% with my ankle. For those of you that don't know, I had ankle surgery nearly 4 months ago. So that was really fun, not being able to walk and to do things. I'm very active. So now I'm getting back to 100% and I'm really excited about it. So that's good.
I'm good to hear it. I
Yeah.
fractured my knee about a year ago, and I wouldn't say it's 100% yet, but it was a long haul, kind of through physio and things to get back to something where I'm comfortable walking longer distances. I still
Yeah.
get pain going up and down stairs, but
Yeah.
you need to kind of you need to look after yourself.
Yeah. My physical therapist actually said that knee surgery is the hardest to recover from. So, for anyone that didn't know that Mervyn is a hard ass, he is. And he could do anything. So that brings us to, okay, why, Danielle, why did you start the conversation that way? Well, it's because today's topic is literally about mental health, and that's what we're focused on. So, I just returned from Transform about a week or two ago, and I noticed that for the first time there was something called psychedelic therapy, and there was a whole panel on it, and it was really interesting. I didn't attend actually, but I do know the founder of the company who, they do psychedelic therapy for employees. And so this article came up from Work Life, and essentially it talks about a few different benefits, including psychedelic therapy, caregiver concierges, sleep programs. So companies essentially are trying to offer more innovative mental health benefits and creating new initiatives. So this is a very interesting topic for me because I feel like the whole mental health wave has been around, but like people haven't really necessarily talked about as much like what specific therapies or mental health interventions they're providing their employees. It just hasn't been as much a part of the conversation. So I'm happy to see it being centered a little bit more, and to hear a little bit about the innovation happening in the space. So that brings me to you, Mervyn. What
Mm.
stands out to you about mental health at work?
What stands out to me is the fact that we can talk about it. We can have these
Mm,
conversations, and I think that the if I go back to when I started in the world of work, we wouldn't have had these kind of conversations. Nobody. Every day you went into an office, said, "Hi, how are you today?" Fine, fine. If somebody would have said, "Actually, I'm feeling really awful today," I said, "Oh, okay." It was it wasn't a conversation that you could have. It was a conversation that if you one to one wanted to speak to someone and say, look, I'm not 100% today. feeling it. I'm not, I had a bad night's sleep, or this, I got these pressures at home, parent is sick or something, it's kind of, it was you brought your work self to work. And I think because of that, there was this disjoint between what you were really feeling and the kind of way you had to be at work.
Yeah. I definitely feel like that's changed, but not as much, I think, as people want it to and expect it to. I was listening to this podcast about, I think it was with Scott Galloway, and he was talking about how much change and how much progress we've made from, like, in terms of just the feminist movement, right? Like, we went from women not be having the right to vote to, like, women being able to do basically anything besides get an abortion, right, legally, federally, in this country. But we did have a huge period before that happened of progression, and it's something to, like, look back on and be so proud of. And even though, like, right now feels really mucky and gross, I am still focused on that, like, positive change and, like, that kind of upwards trend, that is, like, just totally unignorable, right? Because you have centuries and like, just so many years of women being oppressed, and then you have this, like, basically, like, 100-year period of, like, women just flourishing, over time, of course. But that progression is so huge and so vast. And so when you think about something like mental health at work, you think, when you went into the workplace, mental health was totally not something talked about. To now, we're talking about, providing people with free therapy at work, and talking about it, from, like, the perspective of CEOs on LinkedIn. Like, it's kind of crazy, and it's a really beautiful thing for me to watch. And I think we need to sometimes be reminded of that, of, like, how much progress and how different things are now than they used to be, especially when it comes to mental health in the workplace, because of this gap that we're now seeing, right, with, like, the younger generation coming in and expecting certain things, expecting a certain level of support, expecting their managers to be able to hold such sensitive conversations and be able to support them in the ways that they want to be supported. And I think we just need to be considerate and reminded sometimes of, like, well, think about how different things are now than they used to be when, your boss's boss graduated, and that's why we're seeing certain decisions being made that, like, might not be totally aligned with what we want.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if I think back to my earliest jobs, you could, um, if you had problems or issues that may be personal, you could go to your boss or your boss's boss maybe, and just say, look, can I have a private word? And there is this problem, this issue, this thing at home, this wife is sick, or your parents are, the father is very ill, and you could, I suppose, effectively say, look, this is on my mind, therefore I might need a little bit of support. I might need to kind of take some time off at short notice. I don't really want everybody here to know about it. That's why I'm sharing it with you. And I think back when I started work, that would be recognized. That would be, I think of the first, as I said, I think I've said on previous episodes, I started off training as an accountant, and the partners that I worked for, would they saw it as part of their role to look after all of their people. So they would. And then I think we went through this, certainly 80s, 90s, me generation kind of era, which, where it was kind of anything where you might it was very different. It was very different for, you held things back, you held things in. You might go to a British thing. You might go to the pub at lunchtime and have a drink with one or two of your colleagues who you trust to talk to. But you certainly wouldn't want other people in the business to know that. And if there were some really serious issues going on, they weren't the kind of things you wanted to talk about. You didn't want to be judged. You didn't want to be. There was still a quite of a machismo almost about, you leave that at the door when you come in here to work. You have to leave that outside. There was a bit of that as well. And so I suppose, I apologize if you can hear some ringing in the background. I should have, there is a phone ringing in the background, just to show
Is that a landline?
that is a landline.
Oh my gosh, Mervyn.
I know. It's considering
Who calls you on the landline?
my mother-in-law,
And telemarketers.
yeah, that's it. It's my mother-in-law, or
You're like, how did you know?
somebody ringing about an appointment.
Oh my gosh.
For one of them, the doctors or the hospital. So that's the only people who ring that.
Does it stop ringing ever, or does it continuously go?
It will if my wife was there to pick it up, but she's not here at the moment. So it will.
Mervyn, go get the phone.
Oh, I'm certainly not doing that. It hasn't stopped yet. Okay, I shall carry on talking, or would you like me to? Shall I pause this?
You can stop.
It stopped.
Wait, did it stop?
It has stopped.
Okay.
No, I don't know if it just ran.
So funny.
I know. Well, look, it's called X to Z.
It is. It's truly you bring the X.
You've got some real life X action.
You bring the X factor.
Yeah, it's the somebody's ringing me on a landline. So how more X can you get?
So unrelatable to me, but so relatable to probably many people who listen.
And of course, the problem that you would know is you can see on your phone, you can see who's ringing you, so you know if you want to answer it or not.
Yeah.
With old-fashioned landlines, you didn't know who was ringing you,
right?
so you had to answer.
You had to answer it
just in case it was something urgent.
When I was younger, we used to do like star 69 or star 67, whatever it was, and you basically could like call anyone without a caller ID.
Yeah. No, you can do that. Yeah. You could put like 141 in before the number, and then it would be, you wouldn't know who it was from.
Yeah.
And which I suppose comes back into what we're talking about at the moment, in a roundabout way.
Oh.
But yeah, I mean, because it's part of the kind of like bringing your whole self to work thing, which kind of you didn't used to do. I mean, if I think about it, if you wanted to make a personal call in the era before mobiles, if you had to make a personal call from work because the people you were calling, was a medical appointment or something, only operated between 9 and 5, so you could only ring them between 9 and 5.
Right.
You had to actually ask permission when I started work. Can I make a private call? And in some companies, you would have to offer to pay for that private call.
Oh God, I don't like that at all.
Those would be smaller owner-managed businesses who say, "Do you know how much the phone bill costs us every month?"
Oh my gosh, no.
So
I was at an event where we were talking about the phones and how like people used to have company phones, and they wanted the company when the iPhones and like the Blackberries came out, they wanted the company to buy them phones. And this is like people at like big tech companies that are making a lot of money. And then they were like, well, if you're requiring me to have a smartphone, then you also have to pay for my smartphone. And the companies then were like, no, like we pay you enough money where you could pay for your own personal phone bill. Like, no. Which I think is kind of funny when it comes to, who pays for what.
Yeah.
That was a conversation that came up at Transform as well. But going back to what you were saying, like when do you think, like, how do you think this shift actually happened? Like, was it millennials that started this? Was it your generation? Like, what was sort of the progression of normalizing mental health at work?
I think it's happened. I think it happened fairly gradually.
Yeah.
Um, Certainly, if if I use sales as an example, so if you go into a sales office in the 80s or 90s, it was people literally, if we go back to the slick back hair and the kind of, greed is good days, it was literally slamming the phone down beginning to end. You were full on. I mean, I did spend a year in an organization that was, yeah, you were there by 8 o'clock. If you left at 6:30, you were a part timer and frowned upon, and you just
Mm.
had to hammer that phone all day long. And if you weren't really feeling it, if you had things going on in your life, if you were kind of um, upset by things that had happened, or not feeling as if you can give your best, then you had to hide that. It would be seen as a sign of weakness. I could think of one organization I worked for that would had you out the door. If you went in, I mean, you wouldn't say, look, my mental health isn't good today. But if you say, look, can you just give me some latitude today because this happened last night and kind of I'm a bit, so I might not be 100% on it today. You were kind of, I wouldn't say asking for a P45. Mind, that's a British thing. That's asking to have your employment terminated. But I mean, it would be so frowned upon. That you couldn't, own up to this. So I think gradually, I think it began to change. I suppose 90s, a little bit more. You still had hard-driven sales offices and professional offices that were very
Yeah.
focused. But I think understanding of the person, as opposed to just an employee who you own between 9 and 5 or
Right.
something, and that's it. I think there was a bit more understanding, and I think I've not really thought about it, but now you've asked me the question, I'm thinking that it's possibly the beginning of mobile phones, the beginning of
Mm.
having a technology that means you don't have to say, excuse me, can I make a personal call from the office phone? You could do it yourself.
So interesting.
And I think that possibly was a bit of a start. And certainly it didn't. Certainly at the beginning of, and I can think back to offices, because obviously, again, in my early days, people sat there smoking at their desks and everything, and you just
Yeah.
had to passively breathe it all in.
That's
But
so wild.
sometime in the kind of mid 90s, offices would begin to say, no, you can't smoke in the office. You've got to go outside.
Yeah.
And so then you'd
I
have this
watched
hammer.
Mad Men.
Yeah. So how many times you've been outside today to have a cigarette? Oh, 6 or 7. Well,
Yeah.
that's another 60 minutes you owe us or so.
So I
Um,
suppose then like the first mental health perk was let me recognize that you're a whole person and you should be able to make a personal phone call at
yeah,
work.
effectively, yes. Yeah. It kind of like, or you could let your personal intrude. So
Right.
you could say to somebody, look, is it okay? I'm going to be in late tomorrow
Right.
because of this. I'm taking my mother to the doctors or something.
Right.
And that would obviously something like that, depending on the company you were with. There is some companies you could work for and say, no, the hours. But
Yeah.
I can think of most of the places that I've worked in the past would have said, no, we understand that, and you'd
Yeah.
always you'd always say, look, I'll make the time up. I'm going to be in half an hour late, so I'll add half an hour on the
Right.
end. And quite often, if you had an understanding boss, they'd say, don't worry about it.
Right.
Um,
And then
but
and then you basically you fast forward to today. And I have a lot of managers of Gen Z specifically who come to me and they say, I feel like I'm being really considerate and we have great mental health benefits and you can take a day off if you need it. But I feel like sometimes my Gen Z employees are taking advantage of me and they're taking advantage, like too much advantage of the perks, right? And so I had this one person say to me, well, one of the people that works for me who's Gen Z decided one day that because her cat was sick that she couldn't work. And instead of just saying, "Oh, I can't come in today and I'll work remotely," she was like, "No, I just can't work because my cat's sick and I'm upset about it." And what I think I genuinely have a hard time responding because it's I'm my work ethic is just not like that. Like, I'm not going to take a day off because I'm, upset about a cat. However, I will take a day off if I'm upset about, a war going on across the world because my family's there. So, like, I think it's really interesting, um, from my own perspective of like, I grew up at a time when news was so accessible. Like, I don't think it's actually natural for us to know about every world crisis and disaster and, humanitarian crisis or world war that's going on. And so for us to be constantly bombarded like this all the time, I think we're kind of dealing with a generation that has such overload and emotional overload and mental load and like all this stuff, and we don't necessarily have any help or the right help or enough help to deal with it, but yet we're being given these things which are likely hurting us, right? There's, I mean, they are hurting us, and yet we're not the ones that built that technology, and we're not kind of the ones to blame, but yet we're kind of on the hook for it. And so I feel like there's a bit of like a catch 22 going on with my generation of like, well, you're damned if you take too much time off, and you're damned if you don't, because you'll get burnt out, much faster, because the speed of work is more, you're expected to know more, you're expected to do more, you're expected to teach others how to use technology, you're expected to, handle having a job and like doing the right career path and having relationships and your family and taking care of your body and your mind and your soul and like doing all these things. And like, has it always been this way? Like, is this just, or is this like a new age problem that we're dealing with, that we're so overwhelmed?
Well, there is an element of being overwhelmed. I think it's evolved, and I think it's evolved. Every generation, every half generation, gradually evolves things. If I think back over my long period of work, um, I think back at the beginning, when I started as a trainee, I could go to a boss with just a personal issue, and be dealt with sympathetically. Um, we went through, as I say, into certainly 80s, 90s, into the early noughties. It was any personal issue that you might have, was just, you leave that at the door. You're here to work, you leave that there, If you need to take a day or two off, you do. But I mean, if you're not sick, then it was almost like that you had to take 2 days unpaid kind of thing. It was very, very, it could be, not everywhere, but it could be in some organizations very harsh, like that. And I think we obviously now, but the relationship with work is different, because if I link this back to previous conversations you and I have had, it's the whole structure of work. We've been through the financial side, how kind of, it's so different for Gen Z, and that kind of the way you used to structure your life around work because you got paid more and you could do more. That's kind of gone. Permanent employment is not over, not a complete thing of the past, but it's, for people like yourself, you're making your own careers by doing work that interests you. So I mean, it's all of that has changed, and I think with that come different pressures. And so
Right.
that if you undertake an assignment, say if you do a piece of work for another company, I'm going to advise you or consult with you on how to retain Gen Z. Then if you're having a bad day or two, or you're not feeling well, or you've got other issues, that's they don't employ you. They are effectively contracting you to do something. So it's
Right.
probably a different now in that you can do that. Whereas if you are 9 to 5, or working, 50 weeks of the year for one organization for the same 2 or 3 bosses, it would have been different,
Yeah.
because they are the people who say, well, okay, yeah, you can take tomorrow off, but when are you going to make the time up? It was more
Yeah.
that kind of a thing where you
Yeah.
don't, which would then make your problem even worse, because I've got this going on. I'm not feeling it. I'm in a bit of a state. And now it's kind of, I've got to ask for time off. And now I've got to work out when I'm going to make that time up.
Right.
And
It's like
so I
even
think it's quite different now.
And I will say from, referring back to what you were saying about if you have your own business, I've been talking about this with a few people recently. It's like when I have my own business, and maybe other people feel similarly, but it's like when I have my own business, I'm so much more in control that I almost want to work harder. Like I find like, it's easier to find motivation when you're sick, where it's like, oh well, if I don't deliver on this thing, then it will reflect badly on my brand, and and that, like, my long-term relationships with people who are paying me to show up. But if you think about it in terms of like employment, and I've spoken actually to a few business owners recently who are navigating this of like, well, I hired someone contractually and like a part-time kind of basis. And then I hired them full-time, and I found that when they were working part-time, they were actually working harder. And that might be as a result of, well, I feel like I have to prove myself and like, earn a spot on the team. But even if you take that away, I feel like that would still be there. That like kind of work ethic and that like working hard because of ownership. Because at the end of the day, if I'm working for someone else, I'm working for someone else's brand and business, and they have equity, but I don't necessarily have any skin in the game. So why would I work as hard when I could reserve some of my ideas for my own business? And I think like that's kind of the mentality in larger organizations. I find of people who work at at like larger companies, whereas smaller companies, which I've always worked for, like startups, I find that I feel because I have equity, maybe it's because I feel connected to the mission, but I find that I work hard. Maybe I just work hard regardless. I haven't worked for a huge company. I wonder what the shift would feel like. But also I feel like it's also a factor of like who you work for, and like do they inspire you, and do they inspire you to be better every day and to work really hard and do really well. So I feel like there's different factors, but that kind of difference of I work for someone and versus I work for myself and I work harder for myself is a trend that I've seen.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably the norm. If it's something you're invested in yourself, you will probably put more into it. Having said that, I think I think everybody tries to work within the structures they're in. So, I mean, if you were to be employed, I know that's not your goal in life, but if you're employed by an organisation, you could be one day. Plenty of people, certainly in the early days of kind of all social media and all this digitization and stuff, people who weren't working permanently but were doing their own thing were hired by organisations to bring some of that in. So, I mean, when you're working for a bigger entity, you probably feel not more responsible, but you are part of a bigger entity, and you want to do it because there are other people as well. You've got colleagues, you've got,
Right.
you're more visible. Whereas for yourself, as you say, you can set your own boundaries, you can set your own times. You can say, what today I'm taking a chill day because of yesterday, and then I'm going to do this over the next 2 days, and you control your time.
And
I
your own
mean,
expectations of yourself.
indeed, I think we've moved away from the
We have
original topic,
the original topic of mental health, but I think
but well, it's
divulged
all
into
part of the
something
same,
interesting.
yeah, it's all part of the same thing.
Right, 100%. Well, if anyone wants to go and read this article, there were some really interesting examples of mental health benefits. I mean, I think we mentioned the psychedelic therapy. There were also obviously mental health support and platforms and outsourcing, like with coaching calls and virtual therapy. Another one that was interesting was caregiver concierge. So like literally people, having 24/7 support for like their personal needs and their caregiver needs. College counseling is apparently a thing. Holiday shutdowns, I've seen that. Divorce support, very interesting, from Hearst. American Airlines has on-site therapists at airports for their employees, which is awesome. Yeah, there's some really interesting interventions here, and it's always interesting for me personally, as kind of an industry analyst, I would say, to just see what people are providing, and see what's like maybe catching on. Obviously, psychedelic therapy is like really out there, but some companies are doing it, like Dr. Bronner's, which, again, like, we're not going to get into the whole thing, but I think going back to who shepherded and who's shepherding this new wave of mental health, I think it's really the millennials. I think the millennials have gone through, and I know a lot of people are exploring their personal lives, like, different types of therapies, different types of like gatherings, different types of like versions of different religions. And I think they're just very open to exploration. And I think they're kind of now bringing Gen Z into the fold of that. And Gen Z is kind of getting involved and interested. But, when it comes to like somatic therapies too, I mean, there's so many things that are growing, and they're very much connected to like wellness and holistic wellness specifically. So interested to see how that all evolves, especially under this new, Maha administration. But that's all for me. I feel like the mental health conversation we could talk about for literally days. So
We could.
it's
It's
good.
I think it's one of the most important. I won't say trends. One of the most important things at the moment is because we have a greater understanding of the whole self and how people feel and people's relationship with work, people's relationship with the people they work with, and because we now recognise and understand that people need support at different times for different things, and sometimes that doesn't have to be overpowering support. That can just be, you know, you're there, or something is there if they feel they need it. And I think this will, gradually, or is changing the workplace. But I think gradually will change workplaces, because as different generations then take over in the management and leadership, they're going to have different sets of not principles, but different structures, different ways of dealing with things, which are, what they would have wanted. So it's kind of, I think this is a very interesting and evolving space.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point too. It's like, if you find yourself in a difficult position with someone you're managing, it's like, well, how would you have wished that someone would approach you? And like, how would you have wished that this would have been handled if you were in their position? I think that's a really great question to pose to anyone, and to yourself. So with that, we're going to say bye. And thank you so much for joining us on X to Z. Come back next week for another episode, and we'll see ya later.